the autumn of 1896, in the small town of Blackwood Hollow, nestled among the mist-shrouded hills of northern England, lived a young photographer named Thomas Harrow. Having apprenticed with the renowned London photographer James Wellington for 5 years, Thomas had recently returned to his hometown to establish his own modest studio. At 30, he was considered something of a late bloomer by local standards, but his time in London had given him a refinement and technical precision that set his work apart from the provincial photographers who had previously served the community. Photography was still considered somewhat mysterious to many. The ability to capture a moment in time through light and silver chemicals seemed almost magical to the average person. In an age where science was rapidly demystifying the natural world, photography remained a curious blend of technical skill and inexplicable alchemy, and in Thomas's case, perhaps it was more magical than anyone realized. The autumn of 1896 had been particularly melancholy, with persistent rain and thick fog enveloping Blackwood Hollow for weeks. The weather matched Thomas's mood as he struggled to establish his business among townspeople who remembered him only as the odd, quiet boy who had left 10 years earlier. His studio occupied the ground floor of a narrow Victorian townhouse on Chestnut Lane, a respectable but not fashionable address. The space was modest but meticulously arranged. His camera, an impressive Thornton Pickard Royal Ruby, stood proudly on its tripod near the large north-facing window that provided the perfect soft light for portraiture. Glass plates, chemicals, and developing equipment filled the shelves of his darkroom, a small chamber at the back of the studio that Thomas had painstakingly constructed according to the exacting standards he had learned in London. The darkroom was Thomas's sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the familiar chemical processes that transformed blank glass plates into windows to captured moments. The acrid smell of the chemicals, which others found unpleasant, was comforting to him, a reminder of the years of study and practice that had given him mastery over this mysterious art. It was on the 17th of October, amid a particularly fierce autumn storm, that Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell first entered Thomas's studio. The bell above the door jangled sharply as she pushed it open, struggling against the howling wind. Thomas looked up from where he had been polishing his camera lens to see a slender figure dressed entirely in black, her face partially obscured by a heavy mourning veil. Rainwater dripped from her sodden cloak onto the polished wooden floor, forming a small puddle around her boots. "Good afternoon, madam. How may I be of service today?" Thomas asked, setting aside his lens cloth and moving to assist her with her dripping cloak. Mrs. Caldwell did not immediately respond, nor did she relinquish her cloak. She stood silently in the doorway, as still as a statue despite the rain and wind. Then, with gloved hands that Thomas noticed were trembling slightly, she slowly lifted her veil. Thomas was struck by the woman's face. She was young, perhaps no more than 25, with delicate features that spoke of gentle breeding. Her skin was pale as porcelain, her lips bloodless, but it was her eyes that captured Thomas's attention and held it. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and utterly devoid of light. These were eyes that had seen terrible things, eyes that belonged to someone much older than the young woman who stood before him. "I wish to have my portrait taken, Mr. Harrow. A memorial portrait," she said, her voice soft but surprisingly steady. "Of course, Mrs." Thomas let the question hang, aware that he was addressing a member of local gentry, and conscious of the proper formalities. Caldwell, Eleanor Caldwell. The name was familiar to Thomas. The Caldwells were among the wealthiest families in the county, owners of several textile mills that employed half the population of 3 villages. They lived in Caldwell Manor, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Blackwood Hollow that had stood for generations. Memorial photography was common practice in the Victorian era. Photographs of the deceased, particularly of children, provided families with a lasting remembrance of their loved ones. It was a service Thomas had performed several times since opening his studio, though never with any great enthusiasm. The process was technically challenging, arranging the deceased to appear lifelike, capturing the image before decomposition became evident, and emotionally draining. "My condolences for your loss, Mrs. Caldwell. When would you like to schedule the sitting? And may I ask who has passed?" It was necessary information. Photographing an adult required different arrangements than a child, and different still for an infant. A strange expression crossed Eleanor's face, something between confusion and distress. For a moment Thomas thought she might faint, and he took a step toward her, hand outstretched to catch her should she fall. But she recovered, her spine straightening, her chin lifting slightly. Not a sitting for the deceased, Mr. Harrow. A sitting for myself, with my child. I don't understand. You said a memorial portrait. Thomas was genuinely confused. Memorial portraits were, by definition, photographs of the dead or photographs of the living with mementos of the dead. A lock of hair, a favorite toy, an empty chair draped with flowers. Yes, a memorial. To remember. Can you accommodate my request today? The weather is unlikely to improve, and I've come quite a distance. Her tone was polite but insistent, with a brittle quality that suggested she was holding herself together through force of will alone. Thomas was perplexed but unwilling to turn away business, especially from someone of Mrs. Caldwell's obvious social standing. Besides, there was something in her manner that aroused his curiosity, a desperation beneath the carefully maintained composure. Of course, Mrs. Caldwell. Please, come through and make yourself comfortable. I'll prepare the camera. He gestured toward the portrait area at the rear of the studio, where a heavy velvet chair sat against a painted backdrop of classical columns and draped fabric. Eleanor moved with a peculiar stiffness, her black bombazine dress rustling softly with each step. As Thomas prepared his equipment, adjusting the camera and checking the glass plates, he noticed that Eleanor remained standing, her posture rigid and unnatural. Please, Mrs. Caldwell, do sit down. The exposure will require you to remain still for several seconds, and you'll be more comfortable seated. It was standard practice for portrait subjects to be seated, which made it easier for them to maintain the necessary stillness during the relatively long exposure times. I prefer to stand, with your permission. Her voice was soft but firm, brooking no argument. Thomas nodded, somewhat disconcerted by the woman's manner but unwilling to argue. As you wish. And your child, will they be joining us shortly? He glanced toward the door, expecting a nursemaid to enter with an infant or perhaps a young child waiting outside with another servant. Eleanor's pale eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made him step back involuntarily. There was something unnerving in her gaze, a fervent, almost feverish quality that sent a chill down his spine. My child is here, Mr. Harrow. Right here. She lowered her arms to waist height and carefully arranged them as if cradling an infant. But there was nothing there, only air. Thomas felt a cold sensation creep up his spine. In his 2 years as a professional photographer, he had encountered grief in many forms. Stoic fathers standing behind seated wives, mothers clutching locks of hair or small shoes. But this was something altogether different. This was delusion, born of unimaginable loss. Mrs. Caldwell, Eleanor, there's no one there. He spoke gently, as one might to a child or an invalid. Eleanor's expression hardened, her pale eyes narrowing. My son is here, Mr. Harrow. His name is James. James Arthur Caldwell. He is 3 months old today. That is why we have come for this portrait. Now please proceed. There was an edge to her voice now, a warning not to contradict her. Thomas hesitated. The ethical thing would be to refuse, to gently suggest that Mrs. Caldwell seek help from a physician. But there was something in her gaze that stopped him, a desperate, pleading quality beneath the cold determination. And who was he to judge how grief should manifest? Perhaps this charade provided her some comfort. Besides, the business was still new, and he could ill afford to offend a member of the Caldwell family. Very well. Please position yourself as you wish, and remember to remain perfectly still when I remove the lens cap. He ducked beneath the black cloth behind the camera, focusing the lens on Eleanor's figure. Through the ground glass, she appeared almost spectral, her black dress contrasting sharply with her pale face, her arms held in that unnatural pose. Eleanor adjusted her stance, carefully arranging her arms as if positioning a small infant. Her expression softened as she looked down at the empty space she cradled, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. It was the first genuine emotion Thomas had seen on her face. On the count of 3, please hold perfectly still. 1, 2, 3. Thomas removed the lens cap and began counting silently. The heavy storm clouds had darkened the sky to a premature twilight, requiring a longer exposure than usual. 10 seconds, 15, 20. Eleanor remained unnaturally still, her eyes fixed on the empty space in her arms, that small, sad smile never wavering. As Thomas reached 30 seconds, something peculiar happened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop precipitously. Thomas's breath clouded in front of him, and the flame in the gas lamp on the wall beside him flickered violently, casting strange, dancing shadows across the studio. A sound reached his ears, so faint he almost missed it beneath the rumble of thunder outside. A soft, gurgling coo, the unmistakable sound of an infant. Thomas nearly dropped the lens cap as he moved to replace it, ending the exposure. He looked around wildly, seeking the source of the sound, but there was no one in the studio besides himself and Eleanor, who continued to stand motionless, seemingly oblivious to the cold or the sound. Did you hear that?" His voice was unsteady, his heart hammering in his chest. Eleanor's eyes rose to meet his, her expression unchanged. "Hear what, Mr. Harrow?" Thomas shook his head, unwilling to give voice to what he thought he had heard. It was nothing, a trick of the storm, or his own imagination spurred by the unsettling nature of the sitting. "Nothing. Forgive me. I'll need to develop the plate immediately. Would you care to wait? It shouldn't take more than half an hour." "I shall wait." Eleanor finally took a seat, still cradling her invisible burden. She sat ramrod straight, her posture perfect, her gaze now fixed on the middle distance. Thomas retreated to his dark room with the exposed plate, eager to put some distance between himself and his strange client. His hands were trembling slightly as he closed the door behind him, and he took a moment to collect himself in the familiar, chemical-scented darkness. The familiar chemical smell of the dark room was comforting to Thomas. Here, in this small space illuminated only by the dim red light, was where the true magic of photography happened. He worked methodically, his hands moving through the familiar processes automatically, while his mind continued to churn over the peculiar encounter with Mrs. Caldwell. He poured the developer over the glass plate and gently rocked the tray, watching as the image slowly emerged from the silvery surface. First the backdrop, then the dim outline of Eleanor's figure, her face gradually taking shape from the chemical bath. Her expression was clearer now than it had been to his naked eye, that soft maternal smile as she gazed down at her arms, and then Thomas saw something that made him knock over the bottle of developer in shock, sending it crashing to the floor where it shattered, the dark liquid splashing across his boots. There in Eleanor's arms was the unmistakable form of an infant. A baby boy, perhaps 3 months old, with a round face and wide eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera, directly at Thomas. The child was dressed in an elaborate christening gown, its tiny fingers curled around one of Eleanor's gloved fingers. The image was not vague or indistinct. It was as clear and sharp as Eleanor herself, every detail perfectly rendered. The fine lace trim of the christening gown, the wispy hair on the infant's head, even the small button nose and rosebud mouth, all were captured with perfect clarity. Thomas staggered backward, colliding with the shelf behind him and sending several bottles crashing to the floor. This was impossible. There had been nothing in Eleanor's arms. He was certain of it. He had looked directly at her, had seen the empty space she cradled so tenderly. Yet here, on the plate, was a child. A very real, very solid-looking child. With trembling hands, he lifted the plate from the chemical bath and rinsed it, unable to tear his eyes away from the impossible image that had formed. The baby was perfectly clear, not some trick of light or shadow. Every detail was distinct. Thomas's scientific mind raced for a rational explanation. Had there been a double exposure? No, impossible. He had prepared the plate fresh for Mrs. Caldwell's sitting. A flaw in the glass? But flaws didn't create perfect images of infants. Had he somehow failed to see a real child? But that was absurd. No one could overlook the presence of a baby for an entire sitting. There was only one explanation, however impossible it seemed. The camera had captured something that Thomas's naked eye could not see. Thomas emerged from the dark room, the developed plate in his hands, to find Eleanor exactly as he had left her, sitting rigidly in the chair, arms cradled as if holding a child. She looked up at his entrance, her pale eyes questioning. "Is it finished?" Her voice was calm, as if the situation were perfectly normal. Thomas couldn't speak. He simply nodded, still clutching the plate, his mind reeling from what he had discovered. "May I see?" She extended one gloved hand, the other still supporting her invisible burden. Wordlessly, Thomas handed her the glass negative. Eleanor held it up to the light, studying it for a long moment. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, she smiled, a real warm smile that transformed her face entirely. In that moment, she was beautiful, the coldness and desperation melting away to reveal the young woman she truly was. "You've captured him perfectly, Mr. Harrow. His eyes, they're exactly right. So curious, always looking at everything." Her finger traced the outline of the infant's face on the negative, a gesture of such tenderness that Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. Thomas found his voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. "Mrs. Caldwell, there was nothing there when I took the photograph. No child. I would have seen. Some things can only be seen through the right lens, Mr. Harrow. I knew you had the gift the moment I heard about your return to Blackwood Hollow. That's why I came to you." She lowered the negative, her eyes meeting his with a look of profound gratitude. "The gift? I don't understand." Thomas's mind was spinning, unable to grasp what was happening. The ability to see between worlds, to capture what exists beyond the veil. She carefully handed the negative back to Thomas. "I would like 3 prints, please. I'll return for them tomorrow, if that's convenient. The same time." Thomas accepted the negative automatically, his mind reeling. "Mrs. Caldwell, please. I need to understand. This child, James, what happened to him?" A shadow passed over Eleanor's face, the momentary warmth vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "What a curious question, Mr. Harrow. Nothing has happened to my son. He is right here, as you can clearly see in your photograph." With that, she rose from the chair, adjusted her mourning veil over her face, and moved toward the door. Thomas followed, desperate for answers. "Please, Mrs. Caldwell, I must know, for my own peace of mind." Eleanor paused at the door, her hand on the latch. For a moment, Thomas thought she would leave without another word. Then, without turning, she spoke so quietly that he had to strain to hear her over the continuing storm outside. 3 months ago today, I gave birth to James Arthur Caldwell. He was perfect in every way. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a strong cry, eyes the same shade of blue as his father's. But when I awoke the next morning, they told me there had been no child, that I had delivered a stillborn daughter, not a living son, that my mind, overwhelmed by the trauma of a difficult birth, had created a false memory. She turned to face Thomas, lifting her veil once more. There were no tears in her eyes, only that same desperate intensity he had noticed earlier. "They tried to convince me I was mad, Mr. Harrow. My husband, the doctors, even the servants. They spoke in whispers when they thought I couldn't hear, discussing what should be done with poor, delusional Mrs. Caldwell. But I knew the truth. My son lives. And now I have proof." With that, she opened the door and stepped out into the storm, leaving Thomas alone with the impossible negative and far more questions than answers. That night, Thomas could not sleep. The negative sat on his bedside table, and he found himself lighting the lamp repeatedly throughout the night to examine it again, hoping to discover some rational explanation for what had happened. But each time the image was the same. Eleanor Caldwell cradling a perfectly formed infant boy who had not been present when the photograph was taken, or at least not visible to Thomas's eye. By morning, Thomas had resolved to investigate further. After a hasty breakfast, he made his way to the Blackwood Hollow Library, where newspapers from across the county were archived. It didn't take long to find what he was seeking. A small announcement in the society pages of the Blackwood Gazette from 3 months prior. Caldwell tragedy. Sympathy is extended to Mr. Arthur Caldwell and his wife, the former Miss Eleanor Shepherd, on the loss of their infant daughter, stillborn on July 17th at Caldwell Manor. A private burial was held in the family plot, so that part of Eleanor's story was true. She had indeed lost a child 3 months ago, but the announcement clearly stated it was a daughter, not a son as Eleanor claimed, and certainly not a living child. Thomas continued his search, finding several mentions of the Caldwell family in various social contexts. Arthur Caldwell was described as a prosperous industrialist, his family's wealth built on the textile mills that employed half the county. He was considerably older than Eleanor, nearly 50 to her 25, and had been a widower when they married, his first wife having died childless some 5 years earlier. The marriage had been somewhat of a surprise to local society, as the Shepherds, while respectable, were not of the same social standing as the Caldwells. Of greater interest to Thomas was a small item from just 6 weeks ago. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, wife of industrialist Arthur Caldwell, has traveled to Switzerland for the benefit of her health. Mr. Caldwell expressed his hopes for his wife's swift recovery in the alpine air, which has been recommended by physicians for her nervous condition. Yet Eleanor was clearly not in Switzerland. She was here in Blackwood Hollow, visiting Thomas's studio while supposedly recuperating abroad. The contradiction was puzzling and unsettling. Thomas left the library more confused than when he had entered. As he walked back toward his studio, his mind turned over the few facts he had gathered. A young woman who had lost a child, a husband who had sent her away, or at least claimed to have done so, and a photograph that showed the impossible. Lost in thought, Thomas almost didn't notice the man waiting outside his studio until he was nearly upon him. A tall figure in an expensive greatcoat stood examining the display photographs in Thomas's window. As Thomas approached, the man turned, revealing a handsome, if severe face with a meticulously trimmed beard shot through with gray. "Mr. Harrow, I presume?" The man's voice was cultured, his accent betraying an education at one of the better public schools. "Yes, sir. How may I help you?" Thomas felt a sudden unease, though he couldn't have said why. "Arthur Caldwell. I believe you made the acquaintance of my wife yesterday." There was no warmth in the introduction, no extended hand or social pleasantry. Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The fact that Arthur Caldwell knew of Eleanor's visit to the studio suggested he was not as ignorant of her whereabouts as the newspaper item had implied. "Mrs. Caldwell did visit my studio yesterday, yes. I understood she was abroad for her health. A necessary fiction, I'm afraid. My wife's condition required more specialized care than could be found in Switzerland. She has been receiving treatment at Thornfield Asylum, just outside of town. Yesterday, she escaped during an outing in the gardens. The storm hampered the search efforts considerably." Arthur delivered this information casually, as if discussing a minor inconvenience rather than his wife's confinement in an asylum. Thomas struggled to maintain a neutral expression. Thornfield was well known throughout the county, a grim stone edifice where the wealthy sent troublesome relatives who could not be managed at home, the kind of place where inconvenient wives might disappear indefinitely. "I see. And has Mrs. Caldwell been found?" Thomas kept his tone carefully neutral. "She returned to the asylum of her own accord late last night, in quite a state. She was quite insistent about returning here today, to collect photographs," she said. Arthur's tone suggested mild boredom, as if discussing a mildly troublesome servant rather than his wife. But Thomas noted the tension around the man's eyes, the way his gloved hands flexed and relaxed repeatedly. "I understand you took her portrait." "I did." Thomas saw no reason to deny it. Eleanor would surely have told her husband about the sitting. "And did she make any unusual requests?" Arthur's eyes, a cold blue that reminded Thomas of a winter sky, fixed on him with sudden intensity. Thomas hesitated. Something about Arthur Caldwell made him deeply uneasy, a coldness that went beyond mere aristocratic reserve. "Mrs. Caldwell requested a standard portrait. Nothing unusual about it." "I see. And this portrait, is it completed?" "The negative has been developed, but I have not yet made prints. Mrs. Caldwell indicated she would return today to collect them." "That won't be necessary. I'll take the negative now. Name your price." It wasn't a request, but a command, delivered with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Thomas's unease deepened. It was standard practice for photographers to retain their negatives, providing only the prints to clients. A request for the negative itself was unusual and suggested that Arthur Caldwell wanted to ensure no copies could be made. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Caldwell. The negative is the property of the studio. I would be happy to provide you with as many prints as you desire, of course." Thomas maintained a professional tone, though his pulse had quickened. Arthur's expression hardened, the pretense of civility slipping for just a moment to reveal something cold and dangerous beneath. "Perhaps I haven't made myself clear, Mr. Harrow. My wife is unwell, dangerously so. Her delusions about certain matters must not be indulged. It would be detrimental to her recovery. Surely you understand?" "Of course. But I don't see how a simple portrait could." £10 for the negative. That's more than you'd make from prints in a year." The offer was made abruptly, cutting off Thomas's objection. It was an extraordinary sum, more than enough to buy new equipment for the studio, or even put a down payment on a building of his own instead of renting. But Thomas found himself shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. As I said, the negative remains the property of the studio. It's a matter of professional principle." Arthur studied Thomas for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a calling card, which he extended to Thomas. "Very well. When you reconsider, and you will, you may call upon me at this address. £20 if you bring it by nightfall. After that, the price decreases considerably." The implied threat was clear. Thomas accepted the card automatically but made no response to the offer. Arthur nodded curtly as if some business had been satisfactorily concluded, then turned and walked toward a gleaming black carriage that waited at the curb, a uniformed driver sitting stiffly at the reins. As soon as Arthur Caldwell was out of sight, Thomas hurried into his studio and locked the door behind him. Something was very wrong about the entire situation, and he needed time to think. He moved to the dark room and retrieved the negative, holding it up to the light once more. The image remained unchanged. Eleanor Caldwell cradling an infant that Thomas had not seen during the sitting. An infant that, according to all official records, did not exist. Thomas carefully stored the negative in a secure drawer and began preparing his chemicals for making prints. Whatever the truth might be, he had promised Eleanor 3 copies, and he intended to fulfill that promise. The mystery of the child in the photograph would have to wait. The bell above the door jangled, startling Thomas. He had been so absorbed in his work that he hadn't heard anyone approach. Emerging from the dark room, he was surprised to find not Eleanor Caldwell, but a young woman in the plain dress of a domestic servant, her expression anxious as she glanced repeatedly toward the window. "Are you Mr. Harrow?" The photographer. Her voice was low and hurried, with the broad vowels of the local accent. "I am. How may I help you?" Thomas closed the dark room door behind him, careful to keep the negative out of sight. "My name is Mary, sir. I'm a housemaid at Caldwell Manor. Mrs. Caldwell sent me. She said to tell you she cannot come herself. She's being watched too closely now, but that it's urgent she speak with you. She asks if you might call at the servants' entrance of the manor tonight after dark. She'll meet you in the kitchen garden." Thomas hesitated. The request was highly irregular and potentially compromising for both himself and the servant girl. But the mystery of the photograph tugged at him, demanding resolution. "It would be most improper for me to meet Mrs. Caldwell privately, especially at night. Please, sir, she's desperate. They're taking her back to the asylum tomorrow. Permanently this time. I heard Mr. Caldwell say so. She said to tell you. She said to tell you that she can explain about the baby in the photograph, the one only your camera could see." That decided it. Thomas nodded slowly. "Very well. Tell Mrs. Caldwell I'll come tonight after midnight, but I'll need directions to the servants' entrance." Mary quickly provided instructions, her voice low and hurried. When she had finished, she glanced once more toward the window, then slipped out the door without another word. Thomas watched her hurry down the street, her head bowed against the light drizzle that had continued throughout the day. The rest of the day passed with excruciating slowness. Thomas completed the 3 prints for Eleanor, each one showing the same impossible image of the infant in her arms. He found himself studying the child's face, searching for some clue to the mystery. There was something strangely familiar about the infant's features, though Thomas could not place why. As darkness fell, Thomas closed the studio and retired to his rooms above the shop, though not to sleep. Instead, he paced, watching the clock and turning over the events of the past 2 days in his mind. By 11, the streets of Blackwood Hollow were deserted, most houses dark except for the occasional glow of a night lamp in an upstairs window. Thomas donned his heaviest coat. The rain had stopped, but the October night was bitterly cold, and slipped out into the darkness. Caldwell Manor lay on the outskirts of town, a 15-minute walk along increasingly rural lanes. As Thomas approached, the manor emerged from the mist like something from a Gothic novel, a sprawling Victorian edifice of dark stone, its many windows mostly dark at this late hour. Following Mary's directions, Thomas skirted the main grounds and approached from the rear, where a small gate led into what appeared to be a kitchen garden. The area was enclosed by high stone walls covered in climbing plants, now mostly bare in the autumn chill. Thomas waited, shivering slightly in the cold, damp air. The gate opened slowly, revealing Eleanor Caldwell. She had exchanged her formal morning dress for a simpler black gown, and her hair was loose around her shoulders rather than formally arranged. She looked younger like this, and somehow more vulnerable. "Mr. Harrow, you came." There was relief in her voice, as if she had half expected him to ignore her plea. "You said you could explain the photograph." Thomas kept his voice low, conscious of the need for discretion. "Not here. We might be seen from the house. Follow me." She led him through the garden to a small stone outbuilding that might once have been a gardener's cottage but now appeared to be used for storage. Inside, a single oil lamp burned low, casting long shadows across walls lined with gardening implements and wooden crates. "We don't have much time. Arthur's man watches my door, but he's elderly and often dozes. Still, if he wakes and finds me gone." "Mrs. Caldwell, Eleanor, please, tell me about the child in the photograph. Who is he?" "My son, James, just as I told you." Her voice was steady, her gaze direct. "The newspapers reported that you delivered a stillborn daughter 3 months ago." "Yes. The convenient story my husband told the world. A stillborn daughter, easily forgotten. not a living son who might one day inherit Caldwell Manor and the fortune that comes with it. I don't understand. Eleanor moved to sit on one of the wooden crates, gesturing for Thomas to do the same. In the dim lamplight, her face was all hollows and shadows, giving her an almost spectral appearance. When I married Arthur 2 years ago, it was not a love match. My father's shipping business had failed and our family faced ruin. Arthur offered a solution, marriage to me in exchange for settling my father's debts. He wanted an heir, you see. His first wife had given him none, and at his age he was growing desperate to secure the succession. She twisted her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on some middle distance as she continued. I accepted, of course. What choice did I have? And Arthur was correct in his household, if not affectionate. I fell pregnant within the first year of our marriage, much to his satisfaction. The pregnancy progressed normally. The labor was difficult, but not unusually so. Her voice faltered for a moment before she continued. James was born just after midnight on July 17th, a perfect, healthy boy with a strong cry. Arthur was present for the birth. Unusual, I know, but he insisted. I remember his face when the midwife announced it was a boy. He seemed strange, not joyful, as one might expect, almost disappointed. Disappointed? At the birth of a son? Thomas couldn't hide his surprise. I thought I imagined it at the time. I was exhausted after all. The midwife placed James in my arms and I nursed him before falling asleep. When I woke the next morning, her voice broke, and for the first time Thomas saw tears in her pale eyes. They told me my baby had died in the night, that it had been a girl, not a boy, that the difficulty of the birth and the laudanum they had given me for pain had confused my memory. Arthur brought in a doctor who spoke of puerperal mania and delusions common to women after childbirth. I was confined to my room, attended only by nurses who treated me as if I might shatter at any moment, or worse, become violent. But you didn't believe them. How could I? I had held my son, nursed him, counted his fingers and toes. I knew what I had experienced wasn't a delusion, but the more I insisted, the more concerned they became about my condition. After 6 weeks, Arthur announced he was sending me to Switzerland. Instead, he committed me to Thornfield. She rose suddenly, moving to a corner of the shed where she lifted a loose floorboard. From the space beneath, she withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I managed to take this before they removed all my personal items at the asylum. I kept it hidden in my clothing when they searched me. She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small baby's cap, finely made of white cotton with delicate embroidery around the edge. I made this during my confinement. It has my initials embroidered here, in the hem. She pointed to the tiny letters ESC, Eleanor Shepherd Caldwell, almost invisible in the white-on-white embroidery. The night James was born, I placed this cap on his head myself. If I had delivered a stillborn daughter, how could this cap have been used? And why would Arthur insist on a private burial, with not even a vicar present? Why tell everyone I had gone to Switzerland when I was locked away at Thornfield? But why would your husband deny the existence of a son? Most men in his position would celebrate a male heir. This was the part that made the least sense to Thomas. Eleanor carefully rewrapped the cap and returned it to its hiding place before answering. That's what I couldn't understand at first, until I overheard a conversation between Arthur and his brother Charles, who sometimes visits him at the manor. Charles is Arthur's only living relative, his younger brother by 10 years. Before James was born, Charles stood to inherit everything upon Arthur's death, and a legitimate son would displace him in the line of succession. Precisely. I believe Arthur and Charles conspired to eliminate James and have me declared insane so that I could never bear Arthur another child or tell anyone what had happened. The perfect crime. Who would believe the ravings of a mad woman confined to an asylum? But the photograph, how is it possible that my camera captured an image of your son if he wasn't physically present? Eleanor's expression changed, becoming almost transcendent in its intensity. Because James is still with me, Mr. Harrow. Always. Everywhere I go, I can feel his presence. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can hear him crying, not in distress, but simply announcing his hunger or discomfort, as babies do. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Was it possible that Eleanor Caldwell was indeed suffering from delusions, as her husband claimed? That the image in the photograph was some bizarre trick of light or a flaw in the glass plate? Eleanor, grief can manifest in many ways. It's possible that I am not mad, Mr. Harrow. I know what happened to my child, and I believe you know it too. or you would not have come here tonight." She was right about that much. There was something about the photograph that defied rational explanation, something that had compelled Thomas to believe Eleanor's story, despite its apparent impossibility. "The prints you requested, I have them with me." He reached into his coat and withdrew the 3 photographs, carefully wrapped in brown paper. Eleanor took them with trembling hands, unwrapping the package and holding the top print up to the lamp. The image was even clearer in print than in the negative. Eleanor standing rigidly in Thomas's studio, cradling a baby boy who gazed directly at the camera with unnervingly adult eyes. "There you are, my darling, my James." She traced the outline of the infant's face with one finger, her expression a mixture of joy and profound sorrow. "Your camera sees what others cannot, Mr. Harrow. It sees the truth, and the truth is that my son is not gone. He is somewhere else, somewhere between this world and the next. Eleanor, even if what you say is true, even if your husband did somehow dispose of your child and replace him with a stillborn girl, that doesn't explain how my camera could capture an image of him now, doesn't it? You've heard of spirit photography, surely." Thomas had indeed heard of it, a controversial practice wherein photographers claim to capture images of the dead, usually appearing as translucent figures beside their living loved ones. Most such photographs were obvious frauds, created through double exposures or other manipulations. Thomas had always dismissed the entire phenomenon as exploitative charlatanism. "Those are tricks, Eleanor, cruel deceptions practiced on the grieving. Perhaps most are, but what if some are genuine? What if, in rare cases, the camera can indeed capture what exists beyond our limited perception?" Thomas had no answer to that. The evidence was in his hands, a photograph showing something that had not been visible to the naked eye. Unless he had somehow been deceived or had deceived himself, there seemed no rational explanation. "I need your help, Mr. Harrow. Tomorrow, Arthur is returning me to Thornfield, this time with instructions that I am never to be released. Once I'm gone, he will burn these photographs, destroy any evidence that James ever existed, and the truth will be lost forever. What can I possibly do? I'm just a photographer whose camera can see beyond the veil. I need you to find proof of what happened to James, his body, evidence of Arthur's crime, something tangible that even the authorities cannot ignore." That's impossible. I wouldn't know where to begin. And even if I did find something, who would believe me? A struggling photographer making accusations against one of the wealthiest men in the county? Then help me escape. Tonight. I have some money, jewelry I can sell, enough to get us to London, perhaps even to the continent. Thomas stared at her, shocked by the suggestion. "Us? Eleanor, I barely know you. And what you're suggesting is, it's madness. Even if we were to escape tonight, Arthur would hunt us down. Men like him have resources, connections. Then what am I to do? Return to Thornfield to rot away while my husband walks free, my son unavenged?" Before Thomas could respond, a sound from outside froze them both in place. The crunch of footsteps on the gravel path that led to the garden shed. "Someone's coming. Quickly, behind those crates." Thomas extinguished the lamp and moved to hide behind a stack of wooden boxes in the far corner of the shed. Eleanor remained near the door, the photographs clutched tightly in her hand. Through a gap between the crates, Thomas could see her silhouette outlined against the faint moonlight that filtered through the shed's single small window. "I thought I might find you here, Eleanor." Arthur Caldwell stood in the doorway, a lantern in his hand casting harsh shadows across his severe features. Behind him loomed the massive figure of a man Thomas didn't recognize, likely a servant or hired guard. "I was having trouble sleeping. The garden has always brought me comfort." "At midnight? In October? How dedicated you are to your horticulture." Arthur stepped further into the shed, the lantern light sweeping across the space. Thomas pressed himself deeper into the shadows behind the crates, scarcely daring to breathe. "What's that in your hand?" Eleanor made no move to hide the photographs. "The truth, Arthur. Something you've gone to great lengths to conceal." Arthur held out his hand, his expression hardening. "Give them to me." "Why?" "So you can destroy them, as you destroyed our son. We've discussed this, Eleanor. There was no son, only a stillborn daughter. Your mind has created this fantasy as a way to cope with the loss. The doctors at Thornfield understand this, even if you cannot. Then explain these." She thrust the photographs toward him. Arthur took them, holding them up to the lantern light. His expression remained impassive, but Thomas noted the slight widening of his eyes, the momentary tremor in his hand. Clever forgeries. Though I'm disappointed you would resort to such tactics, Eleanor. It shows how far your condition has deteriorated. They're not forgeries. They were taken yesterday by Mr. Thomas Harrow, who I believe is known to you. Ah, so that's why the photographer was so reluctant to part with his negative. You had already enlisted him in your delusion. Arthur carefully folded the photographs and tucked them into his coat pocket. It changes nothing, I'm afraid. The carriage will come for you at 9 tomorrow morning. Dr. Burnett has assured me that Thornfield has made great strides in the treatment of cases like yours. With time and proper care, you may yet recover. I will never stop seeking justice for our son Arthur. Never. That's what I was afraid of. Barrett, please escort Mrs. Caldwell back to her room. Ensure the windows are secured and post Jenkins outside her door for the remainder of the night. The large man stepped forward, taking Eleanor firmly by the arm. She did not resist, but fixed Arthur with a look of such pure hatred that Thomas felt its heat even from his hiding place. You will answer for what you've done. If not in this life, then in the next. Arthur merely inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a minor social pleasantry. Eleanor allowed herself to be led from the shed, her back straight and her head held high despite the circumstances. Arthur remained behind, standing motionless in the center of the small space. You can come out now, Mr. Harrow. I know you're here. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. For a moment he considered remaining hidden, but there seemed little point. The shed was small, with few places to conceal oneself. A thorough search would reveal him in moments. Slowly he rose from his hiding place behind the crates. Mr. Caldwell, I must admit, I'm impressed by your dedication to your craft. Following a clearly disturbed woman to a clandestine midnight meeting to discuss what exactly? Ghosts captured on film? Your wife doesn't strike me as disturbed, Mr. Caldwell. Grief-stricken, perhaps. Desperate for answers, but not insane. And what do you know of sanity, Mr. Harrow? Are you a medical man as well as a photographer? I know what I saw in that photograph. A child that wasn't visible to me during the sitting somehow appeared on the plate. How do you explain that? I don't need to explain it. Photographic tricks are as old as the medium itself. Double exposures, superimposed negatives. The methods are well known. I did not use any such methods. So you say, but who would believe you over me? A struggling photographer barely making his rent against one of the most respected men in the county. Even with these photographs, which will shortly cease to exist, your word would mean nothing. Thomas knew he was right. Arthur Caldwell's position and wealth effectively placed him above suspicion, while Thomas himself had no standing, no influence. What happened to the child, Mr. Caldwell? There was no child, Mr. Harrow, only a stillborn infant, as I've stated repeatedly. Now, I'm going to make you an offer, and I suggest you consider it carefully. Leave Blackwood Hollow tomorrow, return to London, or go elsewhere. I don't particularly care. I'll provide £50 to ease your relocation. In exchange, you will never speak of this matter again to anyone. And if I refuse, then I will be forced to conclude that you suffer from the same delusions as my poor wife. Thornfield has accommodations for men as well as women, Mr. Harrow. And once you're committed, you'll find it very difficult to secure your release without family or friends to advocate for you. The threat was clear, and Thomas had no doubt that Arthur Caldwell had the power to carry it out. A word from such a man to the right authorities, perhaps accompanied by a generous donation to the asylum, would be enough to have Thomas declared insane and committed indefinitely. I understand. I thought you might. You'll find the money at your studio tomorrow. Pack your things and be on the afternoon train. If you're still in Blackwood Hollow by nightfall, our next conversation will be considerably less pleasant. With that, Arthur turned and left the shed, taking the lantern with him and plunging Thomas into darkness. Thomas remained where he was for several long minutes, listening to the retreating footsteps and trying to calm his racing heart. The encounter had left him shaken, but also more convinced than ever that Eleanor Caldwell was telling the truth. Arthur's reaction to the photographs, that momentary flicker of shock before he recovered his composure, had revealed more than all his subsequent denials. When he was certain that Arthur had returned to the house, Thomas slipped out of the shed and made his way back through the kitchen garden to the small gate through which he had entered. The grounds were silent now, the manor house a dark mass against the night sky. As he turned to leave, a movement at one of the upper windows caught his eye. A pale face pressed against the glass, a hand raised in what might have been farewell or a plea for help. Eleanor, watching him go. Thomas returned to his studio, his mind churning with conflicting thoughts. Self-preservation urged him to take Arthur Caldwell's money and leave Blackwood Hollow immediately. But something deeper, A sense of justice, perhaps, or simply the photographer's instinct to uncover truth, rebelled against the idea of abandoning Eleanor to her fate. Sleep was impossible. Instead, Thomas spent the remainder of the night in his darkroom, examining the negative of Eleanor's portrait again and again, searching for some clue he might have missed. The image remained stubbornly unchanged, Eleanor Caldwell cradling an infant that had not been visible during the sitting. As dawn broke, Thomas came to a decision. He could not leave Blackwood Hollow, not yet, not until he had discovered the truth about James Caldwell, a truth he was increasingly convinced lay somewhere on the grounds of Caldwell Manor. But how to investigate without arousing Arthur Caldwell's suspicion? Thomas needed a pretext, a reason to return to the manor that would seem innocent enough. An idea came to him as he was preparing to open the studio for the day. Moving quickly, he gathered his portable camera equipment, a smaller camera than his studio apparatus, but still capable of producing high-quality photographs. It was the sort of camera used for documenting architecture or landscapes, and it would serve his purpose perfectly. At precisely 9 o'clock, Thomas presented himself at the front entrance of Caldwell Manor, equipment in hand. A dour-faced butler answered his knock, regarding him with open suspicion. "Good morning. My name is Thomas Harrow. I'm a photographer commissioned by the Illustrated London News to document historic homes in the county. Caldwell Manor is one of the most significant examples of Victorian architecture in the region, and I was hoping to secure permission to photograph the exterior and grounds." It was a lie, of course. Thomas had no connection to any London publication. But the reference was calculated to appeal to Arthur Caldwell's vanity. The idea of his ancestral home appearing in a prestigious journal would be difficult to resist. "One moment, sir." The butler closed the door, leaving Thomas waiting on the step. After what seemed an eternity but was probably no more than 5 minutes, the door opened again to reveal Arthur Caldwell himself, dressed impeccably despite the early hour. "Mr. Harrow, this is unexpected." "Mr. Caldwell, as I explained to your butler, I'm here on behalf of the Illustrated London News. They're preparing a feature on historic homes in the county, and Caldwell Manor is, of course, among the most impressive." "Indeed, though I find it curious that you failed to mention this commission when we spoke yesterday. The assignment only came through this morning, a telegraph from my editor in London. Apparently, their regular photographer has fallen ill." Arthur studied Thomas for a long moment, clearly weighing the risk of refusing against the potential benefits of having his home featured in a popular publication. "Very well. You may photograph the exterior and the formal gardens. Barrett will accompany you to ensure you don't stray from your assigned areas." As if summoned by his name, the large man Thomas had seen in the garden shed the previous night appeared in the hallway behind Arthur. In daylight, Barrett was even more imposing, well over 6 feet tall, with the build of a prizefighter and a face that suggested he was no stranger to violence. "That's most generous, Mr. Caldwell. I assure you, the article will do justice to your magnificent home." "See that it does. And Mr. Harrow, our previous discussion still stands. I expect you on the afternoon train." With that parting reminder, Arthur turned and disappeared into the depths of the house, leaving Thomas in Barrett's less than gentle care. The manservant led Thomas around the exterior of the manor, maintaining a watchful presence as Thomas set up his camera at various vantage points and exposed several plates. Thomas worked methodically, establishing a rhythm that gradually seemed to lull Barrett into a state of bored inattention. The man remained close but became less vigilant about watching Thomas's every move as the morning progressed. Thomas bided his time, waiting for the right opportunity. It came shortly before noon. As they approached the rear of the property, where the formal gardens gave way to a small ornamental lake, Thomas noticed a carriage drawing up to the front of the house. Barrett noticed it too, his attention momentarily diverted. "Wait here, don't move." The man strode quickly toward the front of the house, presumably to report the arrival of visitors to his employer. Thomas waited until Barrett had disappeared around the corner of the building, then moved swiftly in the opposite direction, toward the area where the family plot must be located, based on what he had seen of the grounds. Beyond the ornamental lake, a small path wound through a copse of ancient yew trees. Thomas followed it, his camera equipment abandoned in favor of speed and stealth. The path ended at a wrought iron gate set into a high stone wall covered with ivy. The gate was unlocked, a stroke of luck that Thomas hadn't dared hope for. Inside was a small private cemetery, the Caldwell family plot Eleanor had mentioned. Perhaps a dozen headstones were arranged in 2 neat rows, most bearing the Caldwell name and dates stretching back to the early 19th century. At the far end stood a small stone mausoleum, its entrance sealed by an ornate iron door. Thomas moved quickly among the graves, searching for any sign of a recent burial. Near the mausoleum, he found what he was looking for, a small, simple stone marker bearing only the inscription, "Infant daughter of Arthur and Eleanor Caldwell, July 17th, 1896. No name, no epitaph, just the bare minimum of information. The earth before the marker showed signs of having been disturbed relatively recently, though grass had begun to grow over the small mound. Thomas knelt beside it, uncertain what he had expected to find. If Eleanor's child had truly been replaced with a stillborn girl, the evidence lay buried beneath the soil at his feet. As he was about to rise, something caught his eye, a small white object partially visible at the edge of the grave, where rain had eroded some of the soil. Thomas reached out and carefully extracted it from the earth. It was a button, a tiny pearl button of the sort used on infant clothing. Thomas turned it over in his palm, noting the distinctive pattern engraved on its surface, a small flower with 6 petals. He had seen buttons like this before, on the christening gown worn by the infant in the photograph. The discovery sent a chill through Thomas. It wasn't definitive proof of anything. Such buttons were common enough on children's clothing, but combined with everything else, it added weight to Eleanor's story. He carefully pocketed the button and was about to conduct a more thorough examination of the gravesite when a sound from the gate made him freeze. "What the bloody hell are you doing in here?" Barrett stood at the cemetery gate, his massive frame blocking the only exit. His expression promised violence, and Thomas knew that explanations would be futile. Instead, he rose slowly, mind racing for some way out of his predicament. "I was curious about the family history. Professional interest, you understand." The cemetery would make a poignant addition to the photographic essay. "Mr. Caldwell was specific about where you were permitted to go. This wasn't included." Thomas backed away, moving toward the mausoleum as Barrett advanced. The manservant's intentions were clear in his clenched fists and narrowed eyes. Thomas had no illusions about his chances in a physical confrontation with the larger man. "I meant no disrespect. I'll leave immediately." "Oh, you'll leave all right, once I've taught you a lesson about trespassing." Thomas's back collided with the cold stone of the mausoleum. He was trapped, with nowhere left to retreat. Barrett was less than 10 feet away now, a grim smile spreading across his face as he recognized Thomas's predicament. And then, something extraordinary happened. The temperature around Thomas plummeted suddenly, his breath clouding in the air despite the relatively mild autumn day. The same cold he had felt in his studio during Eleanor's sitting, a cold that seemed to emanate not from the air but from somewhere beyond. Barrett felt it too. The manservant faltered mid-step, his expression changing from anger to confusion, then to something approaching fear. His gaze fixed on a point just over Thomas's shoulder, his eyes widening in alarm. "What the devil?" Thomas didn't dare turn around. Something told him that whatever Barrett was seeing behind him was meant for the manservant alone. A sound reached Thomas's ears, the same soft gurgling coo he had heard during Eleanor's sitting. But this time, it was accompanied by another sound, a woman's voice singing a lullaby so softly that the words were indistinguishable. Barrett staggered backward, his face draining of color. He made a warding gesture with one hand, then turned and fled through the cemetery gate, moving with surprising speed for a man of his size. Thomas remained where he was, pressed against the cold stone of the mausoleum, heart pounding in his chest. The unearthly cold gradually dissipated, and the ghostly sounds faded away. When Thomas finally found the courage to move, he was alone in the cemetery once more. But he knew he had little time. Barrett would undoubtedly report the incident to Arthur Caldwell, and Thomas's tenuous pretext for being at the manor would not withstand scrutiny. He hurried back along the path through the yew trees, retrieving his abandoned camera equipment before making his way to the front of the house. To his relief, the carriage he had seen earlier was still there, suggesting that Arthur was occupied with visitors. Thomas nodded politely to the coachman as he passed, trying to project an air of having concluded his business legitimately. As he reached the road that led back toward town, Thomas risked a glance back at the manor. A movement at an upper window caught his eye, the same window where he had seen Eleanor the previous night. She was there again, watching him leave. But this time, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, visible only as a faint, luminous outline, was the figure of a woman in old-fashioned dress, cradling what appeared to be an infant in her arms. Thomas quickened his pace, not stopping until he had put considerable distance between himself and Caldwell Manor. His mind was reeling from what he had experienced in the cemetery, an encounter that defied rational explanation, but aligned perfectly with Eleanor's claims about her son's continued presence. By the time Thomas reached his studio, it was past noon. The afternoon train, the one Arthur Caldwell had commanded him to be on, would depart at 3 o'clock. Thomas had less than 3 hours to decide his course of action. Inside the studio, an envelope waited on the counter. Thick, expensive paper bearing the Caldwell seal. Thomas opened it to find £50 in crisp banknotes, the payment Arthur had promised for his silence and departure. It was a substantial sum, more than enough to establish a new studio in another town, perhaps even in London. Thomas stared at the money for a long time, weighing his options. He could take the money and leave, abandoning Eleanor to her fate but ensuring his own safety. Or he could stay and continue investigating, risking Arthur Caldwell's wrath and the very real threat of being committed to Thornfield Asylum on false pretenses. As he deliberated, Thomas absently reached into his pocket and withdrew the small pearl button he had found at the edge of the grave. He turned it over in his fingers, thinking about what it might represent. Evidence of a terrible crime, perhaps, but evidence that no one would believe without corroboration. A sudden thought struck him. If his camera could somehow capture images of James that weren't visible to the naked eye, perhaps it could reveal other hidden truths as well. It was a wild theory, but no wilder than what had already happened with Eleanor's portrait. Thomas moved quickly to his darkroom, where he retrieved the photographic plates he had exposed at Caldwell Manor that morning. He had taken several views of the house and grounds, including one of the ornamental lake with the copse of yew trees visible in the background. If his theory was correct, the developed plates might show something beyond what his eyes had seen. Working with practiced efficiency, Thomas prepared his chemicals and began developing the plates one by one. The first few showed nothing unusual, just the imposing facade of Caldwell Manor, its formal gardens, the conservatory attached to the east wing. But when he reached the plate showing the ornamental lake, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. There, at the edge of the water, barely visible but undeniably present, was the figure of a woman. Not Eleanor, but an older woman dressed in the fashion of perhaps 20 years earlier. She was looking toward the yew trees, one arm outstretched as if pointing or beckoning, and beside her, almost transparent against the dark foliage, was the small figure of a child, a boy of perhaps 4 or 5 years, holding what appeared to be a toy boat. Thomas had not seen these figures when he took the photograph. No one had been near the lake at that time, he was certain of it. Yet here they were, captured on his plate as clearly as the trees and water. With trembling hands, Thomas prepared a print of the image, his mind racing. Who were these figures? What connection did they have to James and Eleanor? And most importantly, what did their presence in the photograph mean for his investigation? As the print developed in its chemical bath, a memory surfaced in Thomas's mind, a local story he had heard as a child, something about a tragedy at Caldwell Manor long before Arthur's time. A drowning, perhaps? Thomas tried to recall the details, but they remained frustratingly vague. The print was finally ready. Thomas lifted it from the bath and examined it more closely. The woman's face was clearer now, handsome rather than beautiful, with a determined set to her jaw that reminded Thomas of Eleanor. And the boy. Thomas felt a cold shock of recognition. The child's features, though those of an older boy rather than an infant, bore a striking resemblance to the baby in Eleanor's portrait. A theory began to form in Thomas's mind, a theory so outlandish that he would have dismissed it as fancy just days ago, before Eleanor Caldwell had walked into his studio with her invisible child. What if the figures in this new photograph were not random spirits but Caldwells from an earlier generation? What if there was a pattern to the tragedies that had befallen the family over the years? Thomas needed to know more about the history of the Caldwells. And for that, he needed access to records that went back further than his own memory or the newspaper archives at the Blackwood Hollow Library. He needed to speak with someone who had lived in the area for decades, someone who might remember the stories that weren't recorded in official histories. He knew just such a person, Mrs. Abigail Winters, the elderly widow who lived in the cottage next to his studio. Mrs. Winters had been a fixture in Blackwood Hollow for as long as anyone could remember, her family having served as housekeepers at the vicarage for generations. If anyone knew the unwritten history of the area's prominent families, it would be her. Thomas glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2. Just an hour before the train Arthur Caldwell expected him to be on would depart. But Thomas had made his decision. He would not leave, not until he had uncovered the truth about James Caldwell, and perhaps about the other ghostly figures his camera had captured. Mrs. Winters was in her garden, despite the chill in the air, tending to the hardy herbs that seemed to thrive under her care regardless of the season. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Winters." "Thomas, my dear boy, what a pleasant surprise. You're usually shut away in that dark room of yours at this hour. I need your help, Mrs. Winters, or rather your memory." "Well, that's something I still have plenty of, even if my joints aren't what they used to be. Come inside and I'll put the kettle on." Thomas followed the old woman into her cottage, a cozy space filled with mementos of a long life. As Mrs. Winters prepared tea, Thomas considered how best to approach his questions without revealing too much of his own recent experiences. "Mrs. Winters, what do you know about the Caldwell family? Specifically, about any tragedies that might have occurred at the manor over the years?" "That's an unusual question, Thomas. Why the interest in old sorrows?" "I'm working on a photographic project about local history. The Caldwells feature prominently, of course, being one of the oldest families in the area." "Well, the Caldwells have had more than their share of tragedy, that's certain. The curse, some call it, though not where any of the family might hear." "Curse? Just a manner of speaking, dear. But there is a pattern if you look for it. Every generation, it seems, loses a child, usually a boy, usually under mysterious circumstances. It started with old Joshua Caldwell's son back in the 1830s. The boy, Walter, I believe his name was, drowned in that ornamental lake on the property. He was 5 years old. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. A boy of about 5 near the lake, just like the child in his photograph. Do you know what happened? How he drowned? The story I heard was that he was playing with a toy boat, a birthday gift, when he fell in. His mother saw it happen from an upstairs window but couldn't reach him in time. She was never the same afterward, poor woman. Died within the year, they say, of a broken heart, though more likely it was consumption. A toy boat. The child in the photograph had been holding what appeared to be a toy boat. The coincidence was too great to dismiss. Were there other incidents with children in the family? Every generation, as I said. Joshua's grandson, that would be Arthur's father, Edward, lost his firstborn son to what they called brain fever in the 1860s. The boy was just 3, and Arthur himself had a younger brother who died under unusual circumstances. Unusual how? The official story was that the child, Charles was his name, fell from the nursery window when he was 4 years old. But there were whispers among the servants that the fall wasn't accidental, that Arthur, who was 14 at the time, had been seen arguing with his brother just before the incident. Thomas's mind was racing. Charles, the same name as Arthur's surviving brother, the one who stood to inherit if Arthur had no legitimate son. But Arthur has a brother named Charles. I've heard him mentioned. Different Charles. The brother who died was Charles Edward Caldwell. The surviving brother, younger than Arthur by 10 years, is Charles Henry Caldwell, named after his late uncle, as was the custom. Though from what I've heard, the second Charles turned out no better than his elder brother. Cut from the same cloth, those two. And Arthur's first wife, I understand she died childless. Isabel Caldwell, a lovely woman, far too good for Arthur. She suffered several miscarriages over the years. The last pregnancy seemed to be progressing well. She was nearly full term. Then one night, there was a commotion at the manor. Dr. Phillips was summoned urgently. By morning, both Isabel and the unborn child were dead. What happened? Officially, complications of childbirth. But my niece was a housemaid at the manor at the time, and she told a different story. She said Isabel had been perfectly well that evening, sitting in the conservatory doing her needlework. Arthur brought her a cup of tea, insisting on preparing it himself rather than allowing the servants to do so. Within an hour, Isabel was in agony. The child was stillborn, and Isabel herself died before dawn. Thomas felt sick. The pattern was becoming clear. A pattern of children dying under suspicious circumstances, always benefiting Arthur Caldwell or his ancestors in some way. Mrs. Winters advised Thomas to speak with Dr. Phillips, who had attended Eleanor's delivery and might be willing to share what he knew. Thomas also learned from Mrs. Winters that the midwife, Mrs. Graves, might have valuable information. As Thomas left Mrs. Winters' cottage, he noticed a small figure huddled on the doorstep of his studio. It was Mary, the housemaid from Caldwell Manor. "Mr. Harrow, thank goodness. I've been waiting for hours." "Mary? What are you doing here? Has something happened at the manor?" "It's Mrs. Caldwell, sir. They've moved up the plans. She's being taken to Thornfield tonight, not tomorrow. Mr. Caldwell gave the orders after he returned from the village earlier. The carriage is being prepared as we speak. Thomas felt a surge of alarm. Tonight? Why the change? I don't know for certain, sir. But there was an argument between Mr. Caldwell and his brother, Mr. Charles. I heard raised voices from the study. Something about loose ends and the photographer knows too much. Then Mr. Caldwell gave orders to have Mrs. Caldwell ready for immediate transfer to Thornfield. So Arthur had been rattled by their confrontation, despite his outward composure. Thomas formulated a plan to intercept the carriage at Blackwood Bridge, where the road narrowed and vehicles had to slow. With Mary's help creating a distraction, he managed to rescue the sedated Eleanor from the carriage and flee with her to a secluded cottage in the woods. As Eleanor recovered from the sedative, they discussed their limited options. Eventually, they decided their only choice was to return to Caldwell Manor to search for evidence in the locked nursery in the East Wing, where Arthur's younger brother had supposedly fallen to his death. Using a secret priest's hole and tunnel that Eleanor knew about, they infiltrated the manor and made their way to Arthur's study to retrieve the nursery key. The old nursery was a time capsule, a child's room frozen in time with toys still scattered about as if their owner had just stepped out momentarily. To their surprise, the room showed signs of recent use. The dust on the toys had been disturbed, as if someone had been playing with them. And on a small bed against the wall lay a white cap and silver rattle that matched those in the photograph of Eleanor with the invisible James. A cold draft suddenly swept through the room, and they heard the soft gurgling coo of an infant, followed by a child's laugh. Following the sounds to an adjoining room, they found an elderly woman seated in a rocking chair by the fire, cradling what appeared to be empty air, but behaving as if holding an infant. I wondered when you would come, Eleanor. I've been waiting. Mother Caldwell? Eleanor's voice was filled with disbelief. The woman was Victoria Caldwell, Arthur's mother, supposedly deceased for 15 years, but very much alive and confined to the East Wing. She revealed that Arthur had always been troubled. As a teenager, he had pushed his younger brother from the nursery window in a jealous rage. When Victoria began questioning Arthur's business practices years later, he had faked her death and imprisoned her. On the night James was born, Arthur came to the nursery where the child had been placed. He intended to smother the boy and replace him with a stillborn infant. But I was waiting. I confronted him, threatened to expose everything: his brother's murder, Isabel's poisoning, my imprisonment. We reached an agreement. The child would officially be declared stillborn, removing the threat to Charles's inheritance. But James would live, here in the East Wing, under my care. Victoria explained that James existed between worlds, a trait that ran in the Caldwell bloodline. He was very much alive, but only visible to certain people or under certain circumstances. Thomas's camera had the rare ability to capture his image. Victoria provided Thomas with a journal documenting Arthur's crimes over the years. As they prepared to leave with James, Arthur confronted them in the garden. He had discovered Victoria's betrayal and captured her. "It's over, Caldwell," Thomas said. "We know everything. About Charles, about Isabel, about what you did to Eleanor and James. And what exactly do you plan to do with this knowledge? Go to the authorities? With what evidence? The ravings of an elderly woman everyone believes dead? The delusions of a wife being transported to an asylum? The wild accusations of a struggling photographer?" "You can't see him, can you, Arthur?" Eleanor said. "Your own son, and you can't see him." "The Caldwell gift, it's denied to you. That's why you resented Charles so much. He could see what you couldn't." Something flickered in Arthur's expression, a crack in his composure. As he moved to recapture Eleanor, Victoria pulled a small pistol from her dress. When Arthur lunged for it, the gun discharged, fatally wounding him. With his dying breath, Arthur admitted his inability to see the things others in his family could see. It was like being colorblind in a world where everyone else sees the full spectrum. In the aftermath, the full truth about Caldwell Manor came to light. Victoria was legally resurrected, and Eleanor remained at the manor with James, assuming control of the estate and family business. Thomas's photographs of Eleanor and the invisible James brought him unexpected fame in scientific and spiritualist circles. His visits to Caldwell Manor became longer and more frequent as the months passed, his friendship with Eleanor deepening into something more profound. 2 years after those fateful October days, they were married in the small chapel on the Caldwell estate, with James, now a sturdy toddler, visible to all present, serving as ring-bearer. Thomas never forgot that it was a simple portrait sitting, a mother holding empty arms, a negative showing a baby there that had changed the course of so many lives, including his own. For in the end, that is what remains when the shadows lift and the truth emerges, not just justice, but peace. The peace that comes from secrets revealed, wrongs righted, and families reunited, whether in this world or somewhere in between.